Prime Minister, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Every good thing has to come to an end, and this is the closing plenary with our very distinguished co-chairs that have supported the summit so much, and I think you have seen them working during the 3 days very hard, all of them. So I don't think I have to present each of them. I think you already know them. These 3 days in South Africa here at our 28th Africa Summit has been tremendous. I think it's been a very impactful summit, happening at a backdrop that is quite complicated. We have had a political situation in South Africa, as you know, with also demonstrations. The President addressed this in a very proactive way yesterday. But we also have Africa that is filled with hope and aspirations. This is the youngest continent in the world, but it is so young that if you look at the 20 youngest countries in the world, 19 of them are in Africa. And we also have a situation where Africa still sees a lot of foreign direct investments coming in. In every other part of the world, we now have seen a stagnation when it comes to foreign direct investments. In Africa, it's still growing, and we also have growth in many economies in Africa. If you look at the 40 fastest growing emerging economies of the world, 20 of them are in Africa. But that growth is also needed, and we need more growth, but it has to be more sustainable, accept the boundaries of nature. It has to create more jobs, but it also has to be more inclusive. This inclusiveness aspect has been a very important one during these days here. Let me start with one of the global CEOs that we have had here as co-chair, Alex Liu. He is the chairman and managing partner of Kearney, one of those big global companies. Alex, you've been very active, and we know that Africa is also faced with new technologies related to the fourth industrial revolution, trying to cope with this. There are huge opportunities in this continent. Your company is also very active. So we would love to hear your, what is your counsel? Because that's what you are giving. What is your counsel to Africa and on the new technologies and on economic growth moving forward?
Well, sure. Well, thanks, and I've appreciated being a co-chair and enjoying the passion of all of you and all of my fellow co-chairs. I mean, from a business perspective, I view Africa as a large-scale startup, just like East Asia was in the early 90s, including China, and just like any Silicon Valley startup, which is matching the opportunity, which we've been talking about for many years, actually, and making it come to reality. And that means, and I think, execution and urgency. It's pretty clear to me that there's a need for jobs, economic development, leveraging innovation, entrepreneurship. What I took away from many of the sessions and the side bilaterals, et cetera, is that we can scale up even faster. I like the Africa Growth Platform idea, which is getting funding and ideas from around the world, including Alibaba and Zenith, and linking them to entrepreneurs here. I like the idea in the skills discussion about how do we take these great ideas about public-private partnership and mapping them to the jobs of the future. I heard a great story about drone technology being used for agro-tech here, pioneered here, and then now being exported to the United States. So if you get all those types of ideas and get them to fruition, there could be a good potential. So the theme is for business investors, foreign and here, is how can we use the 4IR technologies to leapfrog, whether it's in fintech, food tech, safe and smart cities, for example, and eliminate some of the bottlenecks. There's the digital trade bottlenecks. If you want to be an intra-regional power, you need to go from the 19th century to the 21st century in terms of how we handle cross-border trade and customs. We talked in the session about data. If you want to create, collect, and protect your data from outsiders, from people that have bad purposes, and use them for your own purposes, you need a better regulatory framework. That will help investment, make it easier for people to invest in the businesses of the future. So overall, my main question is one of hope, but also a call to action, because the real issue with 4IR technologies is, will you use it in Africa to control your own destiny? Because if you don't, it's a global business. Everyone's looking at Africa as an opportunity to exploit. Africa for Africans should be the opportunity to exploit, inside out versus outside in.
Thank you. I think it was very good, an optimistic one. That was the international CEO's outlook for Africa. Sipho and Pityana, Chairman AngloGold, do you share this outlook of Africa being like a large startup? What is your take on the opportunities and the challenges you see for business in Africa in the coming decade?
Well, thank you very much. I think that we've had a very interesting conversations, clearly, where the threats and concerns about the impact, possibly negative impact of 4IR on the African continent, I think that we talk about more often than not. The good opportunities are there, and I think the conversations reflected a great deal on those. There is a digital divide. Africa is lagging behind in many respects, and so we need to move with speed. The sense one gets is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is a catalyst. After all, the African continent, I know that we believe individually that our countries are big and can do these things in their own right. The moment is one where we need to have an African leadership that is Pan-Africanist, that speaks and thinks in a Pan-Africanist way, and more importantly, acts Pan-Africanist, in that these opportunities require collective platforms. So we need to soften our borders to enable easy movement of high-end skills, given the fact that we don't have skills in abundance, and to be able to adapt to technologies that emerge and take advantage of those, we need easy access to skills across the continent, and indeed to skills of Africans in the diaspora. So our borders and firm borders actually are a drawback on us. If you look at what happens in Europe and in other places, clearly there's a great advantage there. A Pan-Africanist approach would be one that we don't have a nationalistic view in terms of industrialization and our industrial strategies. Each of us wanting to develop major beneficiation plants, even though the minerals that we produce are not of a scale and quantum that would justify that. So we need to possibly think about hubs where these facilities may be shared, and it would have an impact in different areas. We need to think about easy movement of capital within our various regions. So if the Africa Continental Free Trade Area enables those kinds of things, it would assist. We need to enable movement and growth of small and medium enterprises, because as we heard here in the various exchanges, this is one of the most effective platforms for inclusive growth, and small and medium enterprises that are capable of also moving across the different countries. So if this Africa Continental Free Trade Area is to be a true catalyst, we need to build around it an enabling regime that the African leadership in different countries has to do. By the way, I'm talking about an African leadership adopting this approach, and I'm not just addressing myself to governments, but I'm addressing myself to business, to civil society, to trade unions, et cetera, et cetera. The era of protectionist and narrow nationalistic approach is a major drawback for the African continent. So we need to take a different view.
Thank you. I want to pick up on this African Free Trade Agreement as a catalyst and enabler. Arancha, Gonzalez, Laya, Executive Director, International Trade Center. We also heard this question about softening borders, the potential of this free trade agreement. I think trade in Africa amounts only to 17% of all export in Africa. In Asia, Asian export adds up to 50% of all the export from Asian countries. So there is a huge scope here. Is it a trade agreement that will make a difference, do you think, or is there a lot of work to be done still?
No, I think you're absolutely right that this trade agreement is a necessary but insufficient agreement. But it's a necessary ingredient. You know, I like to think of this CFTA as the most delicious African dish that can be produced. The ingredients have been assembled. The cooks are at the kitchen. The guests are impatiently awaiting for this dish to be served. So the cooking should not take too long. And what I heard is that the chefs, and this time the chefs are not the trade ministers, the chefs are the heads of state and government who signed this deal in Kigali, and those that were missing went to Niamey to sign it. They know that they are under pressure because the guests are getting very hungry and very impatient. Businesses are dying, especially small businesses, are dying to capitalize on the benefits of this huge market. At the moment is, as you say, the lowest in the world, but the potential is the highest in the world. Investors are desperately awaiting this continental free trade agreement because they know there are huge investment opportunities. So I think what I've seen in Cape Town in these 3 days is a very clear sense on governments that they need to deliver this as soon as they can. Now, as they do, I think they've also realized that they should not forget, not just to focus on the ins and outs of how you cook the dish, but also how you bring people along. And this is what we've seen in the streets out there. We have to continue with the education that trade is not a zero-sum game. It's not an I win, you lose. That this can be made win-win. And we have to insist in this education to the citizens so that we don't see a bit of the reaction that some would fear from opening markets. Second good message that I heard, Børge, is around electronic commerce, where there is, as a result of this WEF, an action plan that has been put together. An action plan that, in my view, can synergize efforts at the continental level in Africa to unlock the potential of electronic commerce, but synergize this with what is happening in the World Trade Organization, where a big negotiation is also ongoing on electronic commerce. And let me tell you, 76 countries are participating in that negotiation, and only 4 African countries are there. US is there, EU is there, China is there, Japan is there, only 4 African countries. So please, I think there is a better understanding on the need to synergize the two, continental and global.
Wow. You, by the way, reminded me that I haven't had lunch, but...
Get ready.
Yeah, but there is no such thing as a free lunch, so we have to work a bit more. André Hoffmann is Vice Chairman of Roche and also a member of the Board of Trustees of the World Economic Forum. I know that you have a big heart also for nature, André, and after this I know that you're heading to Rwanda. That also has a lot of biodiversity. So did nature have the space at this summit that you expected?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Børge. Heart, it's not a question of heart, it's a question of...
Closer to the mic.
Yes, heart. It's not a question of heart, it's a question of head. You know, if I look at Africa and if I look at the particularism of Africa, of course we are the World Economic Forum, we need to talk about job creation, we need to talk about industrialization, we need to talk about growth. But the particularity of Africa, the particularism of the African culture is this overwhelming nature that surrounds you. So the idea, and I've had the opportunity to discuss that with a number of you over the last 3 days, the idea that the development model of the less developed part of the African continent all has to do with replicating what has been done somewhere else is wrong. Culturally, there is something much more powerful here, and that nature has an opportunity to give you something that we have not anymore, that we have lost. And I think it is extraordinarily important to understand that nature is not something that stops you to develop, but that it is an opportunity for development. In fact, I've been hearing in different meetings, it's $1 trillion opportunity for investment. If you look at infrastructure, as long as infrastructure is green and treats nature with respect, you will be able to achieve better results than what you achieve in other places by treating it as an aid to development and not as an impediment to development. Now, that might sound a little bit airy-fairy, and I know that a number of people are absolutely convinced that the only way to be efficient is to ignore nature and to destroy it so that you can grow. There is a growth model which can be participative, and there is leadership that Africa can show to the rest of the world. I urge the participants to this forum to think about how they could make their business more nature-friendly, and not just because nature is beautiful, but because nature is the thing that supports our life on Earth. David Attenborough at the last meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos talked about maintaining the life system support on Earth. And that is very, very real feeling. So we will bring the theme again to Davos in 6 months' time. But in the meantime, I have this vision of a strong, culturally driven Africa who could help us to give nature the position it truly deserves.
Thank you, and I think this is a nice bridge over to you, Alan Agler, Chief Executive Officer of the End Fund. This collaboration between philanthropic organizations and civil society and possibly also business can make a huge difference also to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and all this. So reflections from your side after 3 days here?
Well, first of all, this has been an amazing 3 days, and it has been a personal honor to serve for the first time as a co-chair. And I'm thinking about, cooks coming together in a kitchen, as Arancha said. We all came together a few days ago, and most of us, didn't know each other. And I find that over the course of 3 days, I have done and feel like observed what WEF does best, which is weave together a community in a deeper way. And I find myself passionate about disease elimination, and I've seen amazing discussions about how philanthropy and civil society can work together in a different way. But I've also been telling people about AngloGold social impact, and I've also been pitching the South African government about what Wellcome is doing on mental health. I feel like I've never knew so much about e-commerce and how to advocate for that as an issue, and the opportunity of the Africa Growth Platform. I mean, all of us have gone deeper with issues that we're challenging with, and I see that across this whole community. And to me, it's a reminder of we can all do more. We can all actually have an influence outside of our own sector. We need platforms like this to integrate and communicate and to get really tangible about what does that look like and what are the next steps and what's actionable. I can't help but see Elsie here in the front row and thank her so much for her vision with this. I remember 4 years ago we were here in Cape Town, and Elsie stood on this stage and talked about what I feel as well. There are so many challenges to getting this work done. It's hard for all of us personally, the sacrifices that we make, but also the opportunities that we have. And she laid out all of these challenges, and she said to everyone, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to do it anyway. And I think that was something that I took home and I continue to remember from 4 years ago. Like, what are those things that feel hard right now, but we know are needed, that they're shouting about in the streets, that we feel in our own heart? And I just feel that same call after this meeting. Like, we can all do more, and we can do more not only for pushing new models of how we work together, but across all these sectors. So it's just a huge honor.
Thank you so much. The honor was ours. Jeremy Farrar, Director, Wellcome Trust. Your contribution to this continent is vast, and I know the work you've done in the area of vaccines, but you are also involved in so many projects. So it was great to have you here as a co-chair, and I guess you have reflected on what other co-chairs have said, and also your vision for moving forward in Africa.
Yeah, thanks very much. And just one piece of advice to future co-chairs: always try and not end up as the last commentary on the table, because otherwise you're left with very little to say and only in agreement with what others have said. One of the joys of being here for the last 3 days, though, has been to be able to try and forget for a little bit the horrors of Brexit. And Brexit has hardly come up as a conversation. But I think there are potentially important things to learn from Brexit, and I'm not going to comment on countries across the Atlantic. I'll stick to the country I come from. And that is, as we've heard from my other co-chairs, we are at a time of remarkable progress in so many ways. But there is no doubt that we also face some huge challenges: climate change, the coming of drug resistance, epidemics in the health arena, the non-communicable diseases. But perhaps the biggest one of all, even in my view bigger than climate change, is inequality. And if we go through the fourth industrial revolution, which WEF has been so brilliant at pushing forward, and we don't learn some of the lessons from the first three, and how we did leave parts of society behind or outside the progress that can be made, it doesn't matter what the elites that everybody in this room is part of design or think about. But if we don't bring society and the community with us as part of the development of that future, then I'm afraid it will end up in similar tensions that the first, the second, and the third industrial revolutions had. And from my background as a doctor, as a scientist, the ability to address some of our great challenges through science and innovation in the public and the private sector is almost unprecedented in human history. But we have to act, we have to see the urgency, and we have to ensure that we don't leave society outside the room, but is part of it, because without them, we won't be able to achieve the progress that's possible.
Thank you. I think your intervention showed that there were still a lot to cover. You'll have a chance to come back. I would like to go back to Sipho Pityana, the chairman of Anglo. Two things I would like you to comment on. One is on the question that Jeremy just mentioned about inequalities, how to create necessary economic growth. That is a prerequisite when you have all these young people, but also making sure that that growth is more inclusive. How is that, how to combine those two things? As one question. The other one is this pan-Africanist vision and action and approach that you're asking for. Do you see leaders in Africa today that are committed to this? Because it's really about leadership. So those two questions, and you have 1.5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I think that the very Africa approach, but the rhetoric tends to be nationalistic as well. I want the following things for my country, I want the following things for my country. And the problem, of course, is that more often than not, there isn't sufficient scale, and that's keeping us backwards. So all I'm saying is that let's build on the underlying sentiment of strong Pan-Africanism. You know, shouldn't we be talking about buying African? Shouldn't we be talking about protection of investments, promotion and protection of investments of Africans in different African economies, so that the scourge of what we saw in xenophobic attacks of small businesses in Johannesburg and in KwaZulu-Natal should be frowned upon not only by people in this room, but by the African continent in its entirety. Because to the extent that we don't have that embraced by the entirety of societies where we are, it's a drawback. So that's the point that I'm making in respect of that. So it's very, very important. The idea that business comes into, and I'm talking about big business now, particularly multinational companies, that you go into various jurisdictions on the African continent to make a quick buck and dash off, is an outdated model of business engagement. Business has to define itself as a partner with the African countries in the pursuit of the Agenda 2063, which is an agenda of the African continent, in ensuring that sustainable development goals are realized, in raising issues that could make it more possible for the African countries to achieve potential that all of us talk to. And that the nature and the relation and the structuring of the relationships between business, particularly business and governments, is a sustainable one. We've had and participated in conversations around the role of business in post-conflict sustaining of peace, and business must have a role there. Where do demobilized combatants land up? They must be afforded job opportunities, they must be trained, they must be enabled to be entrepreneurs. Businesses must not be corrupt and fund illicit activities that end up propping up wars. So all of these things suggest that to the extent that business is outside of this conversation, it will be a force for the destruction of the continent when we can turn it into a positive force for the development of the continent.
Thank you. André Hoffmann, you were noting very actively when it was mentioned that business as a partner. Business has to be a partner also with African development. And we have two schools here. We have the school that business has also a broader responsibility, as also the World Economic Forum was founded on, and another school saying the business of business is business. So for Roche and your company, where you were vice chairman, I guess you have also a clear vision for taking broad responsibilities.
So the statement that made me nod vigorously is the one who's saying you don't make a quick buck and you run away. You know, you really need to build this partnership. And to come back to this notion of long-term thinking is absolutely essential for corporations. The aim of corporation is not just to make money, the aim of corporation is to serve a community. And I can see that in Africa, this would be a particularly relevant thing. If you want to create a prosperity which is going to solve some of the issues we've been discussing here, i.e. health and hunger, you will need to make sure that there is a long-term thinking into the way business is conducted. And that, I'm afraid to say, hasn't been the case in the past. And that's one of the reasons why I would like to sort of propose this model of a nature-based economy, because nature is something that is going to be staying as long as we need it. Nature-enhancing economy is what I would really see as a model. In agriculture in particular, you know, we can, with the help of new technologies, increase the amount of efficacy of farming and the better use of water and better use of resources allocation in the whole farming construction. We've spent a lot of time saying, you know, nature should be able to pay its keep. If we keep it, it's because it actually pays for itself. And the way to do this normally is to talk about tourism and of any definitions. But tourism, although it's an important contributor, will never be sufficient. We need to find other ways of the fourth industrial revolution as a way to deal with that, and I hope that there will be a number of investments of that nature being done around us. The simple message is this one. Business can also be a long-term partner. Business is not only there for exploiting, taking what is here and run away. Business is here for the long term, and in particular SMEs. So I very much welcome your remarks. And again, I had this discussion with a number of you, and I know that it is a feeling that is growing. People really believe in it, and I'm so glad to hear that.
Thank you, André. It's tempting then to turn to you, Alex. Some people talk about like hard-nosed American CEOs, but we saw also that the U.S. Business Roundtable came out on this topic. André was just saying, no, it needs to be, business needs to be a long-term partner and not run away. But then you also have those that say that, you know, it's too complicated. Business of business is business. You have to make money and then you will tax them. Reflections from you?
Well, certainly. I mean, I can't speak for all types of businesses and the like, and it's great to be a private company versus a public company. I personally believe, and my firm believes, that you know, the definition of success has to be more than financial. We have an obligation as trustees and stewards of this world and the communities we serve to have a lasting positive impact on the people that we employ, the people that we could employ and influence and inspire, as well as the communities that we mutually should benefit from. So fully behind that approach. I mean, to Sipho's point, and I think the small and medium businesses in particular are the future and the heartbeat of any economy, but particularly African economies, because you have less of a reliance on sort of global export, MNCs, et cetera, as, for example, Asia did, or even Latin America. So you got to make that work. And I agree also with the analogy, Arancha, but you know, it is a meal that needs multiple chefs, but they can get in the way of each other. You need to find a way to be inclusive and less adversarial, take away some of the stereotypes. Not all businesses act the same way. Not all communities and governments act in the same way. And I think there is a win-win here if we actually can share perspectives. So if I was a business person talking to the governments and the regulators of Africa, what I would say is, listen, you got to start with reality. We've got a lot of different countries at different starting points because Africa is 54 countries. But you also have 54 different legislative frameworks on data.
Yep.
Okay, only 23 of those 54 countries actually have a legislation framework, and I'm sure it's not harmonized. 7 of them are in draft mode. The others have either no data or no legislation. I'm not saying that everyone needs to have it, but if you want to have a free trade environment and the future and the vision in 2063 or even 2023, there needs to be a little bit more movement and more cooperation and acknowledgement that everyone needs to contribute to the success of this great continent.
I think, Jeremy, you wanted to comment? Okay, then on Arancha, on this more standards that are shared, 54 different standards. It's not really internal market.
Yeah, and this is exactly very clearly illustrated in the discussions on electronic commerce, which at the end of the day has a lot to do with, for example, data protection. If every country treats the issue of data protection on a purely national basis, it's going to fragment, not create a level playing field. So what we need is solutions that will help us build a level playing field below the national, understanding that maybe the systems would be slightly different, but they will be interoperable. There will be ways to move with passerelles from one system to another to benefit from this larger market. There is one issue, though, that I wanted to come back to, having listened to Sipho, which is, at the end of the day, all these trade agreements need to be made to work for the 99% of businesses in this continent, which are small and medium companies. And in these small and medium companies, there is a big category called women-owned businesses that today are not exactly in a very good position to benefit from this agreement. We've heard all the issues around gender-based violence, and I suffice it to say that on this one, I think we have to put an end to that. But there are many other areas where the position of women is also not equal to that of men. And this is also in the economy. So supporting women entrepreneurs, also take advantage from the Continental Free Trade Agreement, will be important for the solidity, not just for the justice, but for the solidity of the efforts of integrating trade in the continent.
Thank you. Jeremy, you were mentioning how science could also contribute to development, and your partnership, for example, in also developing vaccines to fight pandemics has been so important, and we've seen that now lately also with the Ebola outbreak in DRC. I think you have a strong message there. So could you share some of what you have done, but also your aspirations in the coming year?
Yeah, and to pay tribute to the role that you played in a previous life from Norway, and pay tribute to what Norway's done for global health, which is...
I wasn't fishing for that, no, but thank you.
Staggering. And a particular individual called Tore Godal, who deserves enormous credit from all of us. I heard the Prime Minister of Norway recently describe him as the most expensive Norwegian ever, but he's changed the world in terms of the vaccines that came along. Yeah, what we together set up, along with others, the Gates Foundation, Japan, Germany, and other governments around the world, was to try and ensure that money, capital, and pricing did not stop the development of innovative science when there was not going to be a market. Epidemics come and go. You cannot rely on the sales of those vaccines. There's no market incentives. We're facing the same problem with the rise of drug resistance, and what we created together called CEPI was an attempt to try and bring public-private partnerships to bear to make vaccines for epidemic diseases, and has been extraordinarily successful with the vaccines in DRC at the moment. But I met this morning with what we were hearing from Alex and others, a medium-sized vaccine manufacturing company here in Cape Town. University of Cape Town is an extraordinarily strong academic institution, one of the best universities in the world, certainly also in the continent, and a spin-out from there. 200 or 300 people now. They're going to be too small to move through the regulatory pathway of every country on the continent, and yet Africa desperately needs vaccine manufacturing capacity on the continent for Africa, run by Africans, providing vaccines for Africans and making a profit in order to do so. And here was a company that struggled with short-term grants and small amounts of money in order to move forward, and won't be able to actually compete with larger organizations when it comes to getting regulatory approval in every country. So regulatory and trade is not just about the movement of e-commerce and the fourth industrial, it's about some of the things that we need today. And a regulatory environment across the continent that brought together the drug regulatory agencies would have a dramatic impact on the ability to transform some truly great science through organizations like the African Academy of Sciences into things that people need to make health better.
Wow. Arancha, can't we just fix this?
I mean, what I would tell you is exactly the same answer that we have on data protection, on food standards, on medicine standards, on standards for mobile phones, on standards for cars, is if you take a purely national approach, it's not going to work. You need a collaborative effort. And this is why multilateralism matters. And this is why it matters that we nurture the multilateral organizations that give us this global level playing field.
Wow. Of course, the World Economic Forum is impartial and neutral, but that was a very timely comment. I'm thinking of you, Ellen. This is also something that is very close to your heart, health, vaccination, mobilizing also the public. So,
Well, I'm really struck by the comment on, is it business for the sake of shareholders or is it business for social good? And I just would say that's a false dichotomy. And, we've seen over and over working with the pharmaceutical sector, it's amazing how many times I engage with the pharma sector and they say, we keep the best people because of our programs on engaging in neglected diseases. That's one of the things that actually helps with retention, helps with talent acquisition. I think that from the mining sector, it was very clear that when they saw the impact on labor productivity, if they didn't deal with malaria amongst their workers, they weren't going to be able to have as much profits. Yeah. And I think Jeremy gave such an excellent example. I mean, the efforts around trying to manufacture drugs, manufacture vaccines, having more proximity of production of supplies. I mean, a huge amount of the health economy is goods and supplies. And if more can be created on this continent, I think it's an opportunity not for better health outcomes, but also for growth. I think we've looked at, in general, the health economy is about 10% or more of GDP globally, and in Africa it's only 6%, and that gap represents a huge opportunity for growth. Yep. And for jobs that are more gender friendly, in the sense that usually 2/3 of women are employed in the health sector, whereas it's more like 40% in other sectors. So I just think, Arancha, she has an amazing way of putting words, but we were at dinner the other night and she was talking about how, one way to look at Pan-Africanism also is through the disease elimination, because mosquitoes don't have passports. We have to work cross-border. We have to work in on a regional perspective, especially when vectors are traveling and changing, and the impact of climate change on disease is also shifting dynamics so much. So huge opportunities, I think, and that looking at Pan-Africanism through that lens of public health. I know that the African CDC was featured here this week, and I think that having more institutions that really are looking at things from a systems lens and a continental lens is quite exciting. And I know that from my perspective, there are so many philanthropists and so many actors in civil society who want to plug into that from a real systems change level.
Wow. You're really good at those sound bites, I have to say, Arancha. Mosquitoes don't have passports. I think also CO2 emissions doesn't have passports.
Absolutely.
Maybe we should share that information more broadly. Huh?
Data doesn't have passports either.
Since we're in Africa and South Africa, maybe let's have Sipho have the last word here on this, what I think has been an excellent panel. We have brilliant co-chairs this year. Thank you, Elsie, for making such a great selection. But there is so much at stake here in Africa. So we need really Pan-African leadership and action. And Sipho, you're not only an experienced businessman, but you also spend a lot of your career in government. So last minute, are you optimistic on behalf of Africa? Do you think you will overcome all the challenges moving forward? Is this Africa the new Asia, and is this Africa's century?
Well, I think that the prospects for the African continent are bright, and we know what needs to be done. We need leadership that is capable and has the determination to act and act collaboratively. It is estimated, by the way, that in 2020, 39% of core skills for various occupations on the African continent will have changed. What does that mean in terms of how we share infrastructure across the continent to enable the digital generation, that young people, the youth bulge that we have here, which is an advantage for the African continent, to connect and enable and access those skills and be pioneers, innovators, and a new generation that is capable of driving the change that we're talking about. It means that we should improve access to educational infrastructure across the continent. The idea that you must sit with the planning department of a particular ministry, in your government, and all of that, and plan building schools and training centers and universities, that layout of that infrastructure is going to take a long time. So we need to think differently about how we use technology for e-learning, online learning, access world-class institutions on the continent, in the world, top-class training facilities and institutions, if we're going to indeed move with speed to access and enable young people who are yearning for these opportunities that they can see in front of them, take advantage of those. That's the kind of approach that we need to adopt. That's the kind of approach that we need to pursue.
Thank you. Again, I would like to thank our distinguished co-chairs. When we finish with this panel, we're not done because we also have a couple of other very nice things that are going to happen. We're going to have some more contributions, and we're also going to end with some music. So please be seated. We're going to rearrange a little bit, but we are fast in doing that. But again, on behalf of the World Economic Forum, on behalf of Professor Schwab and myself, thank you so much for being our co-chairs and also contributing so much on the substance. And I think we even had a little bit fun at the end, even if we're dealing with very serious issues. So thank you.
Yeah.